Well, you can't really talk about the early second wave of the women's movement without talking about lesbian feminism. We're not even allowed to.
This is a WLRN extended interview. On July 1st, 2020, WLRN's Danielle Whitaker spoke with Abigail Shrier about her new book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze Seducing Our Daughters. Ms. Shrier holds degrees from Columbia University, the University of Oxford, and Yale Law School, and is a frequent contributor to the Wall Street Journal. For this book, she conducted nearly 200 interviews with trans-identified females, their parents, doctors, trans activists, and detransitioners to understand the dangers behind the trans phenomenon and why this movement has become so prevalent among young women and girls.
So could you start by just telling us a little bit about yourself, your background, as a writer, and what kind of led you into exploring this topic?
Sure. I'm a journalist. I write most often for the Wall Street Journal, and I wrote an op-ed for them in January of, not this past January, but the one before, I guess that would be 2019, about gender pronoun laws that assign criminal penalties if you misgender someone or don't use their pronouns. And these are straightforwardly unconstitutional. In America, the government can't make you say things. So I wrote that, and a reader wrote to me and said, listen, this is what happened to my daughter. Can you please take up this issue?
Interesting. So you mentioned the pronouns. I was going to ask, how did you decide what pronouns and terms to use for the people that you interviewed in your book? Like, did you always use their individual preferences, or did you kind of go with the words you felt were more appropriate or accurate?
So I gave a little disclaimer about that in the beginning, and the disclaimer is that I don't think teenagers are the same as adults. So the young teenage girls caught up in this this craze or this social contagion, I don't refer to as he. I think it would be too confusing. And in any way, they really are children in a very important sense. These are not fully formed adults. But transgender adults who I interviewed, by and large, I referred to almost uniformly by whatever pronouns they prefer, as a courtesy. And, I have no problem doing that. But I the only time I made an exception to that was where I thought it was really getting confusing.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it can be confusing. I think a lot of times that's the point.
That's exactly right.
And, as we see this movement in the media at large, it's primarily spearheaded and lobbied for by men who are identifying as women. I mean, primarily privileged, heterosexual white men. So as a feminist, I see the trans experience and the motivating factors to be very different for females and for males. So could you describe kind of what inspired you to focus specifically on the experience of young women and girls, and, what similarities or differences do you see between the two sexes in this movement?
You gave me so much to talk about. That there's, a lot of good stuff there. I focus on girls because I was one, and I actually started out my initial pitch that I had written to my agent was to write a contemporary book about how young women were doing, and it was supposed to be a sort of feminist update on how young women were doing. And that's when I came to this topic, and I realized they were doing a lot worse than I thought. I think you're absolutely right. Why biological men, should have something to say, and they are the dominant activists in this group, why they should have something to say about the bodies of young girls, I don't understand.
Yeah, and I think that's part of what I think is making people, I guess the term we use is peak, sort of come to realize that all the craziness of what they're saying. And I think that's what makes people realize this is primarily a men's rights movement. I mean, is that kind of how you see it as well?
The transgender, so the activist movement, I don't know what you have. I think that you have a collection of lots of different people. You have some genuine transgender people, and I interview a lot of very, very nice people in my book. who are transgender adults who really came to this through a sober process and are very, very rational people. And then you have the activist extremists, and they really run the gamut to insane, from insane to deliberately trying to harm women. And then there must be some, sincere people mixed in. But I do say this activist group is really something.
Yeah. So how do you personally define, someone who's really transgender, or, transgenderism as a concept, or, transphobia, since it seems like nowadays anything that you say against any of them about anything is transphobia. And there's this whole discussion of who's really trans versus who's just, following a trend. I mean, how do you define those terms? It seems like they kind of rely on keeping the terms vague in order to further their agenda.
They absolutely do. So I try to talk in terms of gender dysphoria, because that's a real thing. We have a 100-year diagnostic history, and it's something that always afflicted young males, and it always began in early childhood predominantly. Okay. Mm-hmm. So we knew what it was. It had symptoms. It was severe. It was a real distress. And it was little boys who showed a constant, they say insistent, consistent, persistent, real discomfort in their biological sex. What we're seeing now with these, transgender identified, these biological girls, teenage girls with no childhood history of gender dysphoria, is a totally different phenomenon. It doesn't look like gender dysphoria.
Yeah. Yeah. And I wonder, from what I've seen, the young girls seem to be motivated by the desire to sort of escape this femininity that's imposed on them and the way that the world sees them as women, the sort of the secondary sex, whereas most trans-identifying males seem to be motivated by something else. It's more of either a fetish, or it seems to be, there's definitely seems to be more misogyny involved in the way that they're pursuing this. Is that kind of what you're seeing?
Well, the young girls, what they're focused on is not what girls with the small number of girls who had genuine gender dysphoria, they were really trying to pass. I mean, you think about Boys Don't Cry and movies like that. There were examples of this, and they were really trying to pass. What these girls are very different. They don't actually want to be men. They almost never pursue phalloplasty. It's very rare, right? Mm-hmm. They don't want to seem like men. What they want to be is to escape womanhood. And very often they'll try to be non-binary. They want to be an intermediate stage, but they don't exactly want to be a man. All that they know is they don't want to be a woman.
Yeah. I think any woman can relate to feeling that way at some point in our lives.
That's exactly right. It's a very, very normal feeling. And unfortunately, it's just been taken too far. And I do think at least part of the problem is they don't know how wonderful it is to be a woman. And I think what you said is right. They're getting these hyper feminized images. And one of the things they're getting is really violent pornography. Mm-hmm. They think being a woman means being brutalized.
Yeah.
There's so much internet porn, and they're seeing it so young, and it's so violent.
Yeah, I mean, that is, as radical feminists, that's one of, porn and the prostitution and the sex trafficking and the sex industry and all of that is one of the, our areas, our main areas of focus. So I think that all plays into it. I mean, if you look at the root cause of what's leading to this gender dysphoria or this complete agony over their biological sex, it seems to all come down to the root of how women are perceived in society, which is, that sex-based oppression that we're not allowed to talk about now, apparently.
Well, I'll tell you what two things. One, people need to understand, I think, because I didn't used to be so anti-porn as I am now. Because, you think about the images of Playboy and you wonder, I don't know, it doesn't seem that harmful necessarily. People need to understand that the violent porn that's available to children on the internet is so vile and so frightening to a young girl. It is so damaging. And it's, they imagine this sort of, staid pages of a magazine. It's nothing like that. It's so much more damaging. But I will say this also I don't think it's just women in society. I actually think a lot of it is women on social media. the images on social media and the discussion of women and the tearing down of women on social media really rattles these girls.
Yeah, I mean, even as an adult, I mean, I'm in my late 30s now, and if I spend too much time on social media, you know, it can be depressing, it causes anxiety. I mean, it's just completely messed with the way that we perceive the world, I think, and the way we perceive other people and ourselves, and this constant sort of comparison. I mean, yeah, it can be very toxic. So it makes sense that kind of this whole, you know, trans phenomenon for these young girls sort of coincides with the onset of social media and the increased popularity.
Yeah, and I'm glad you said that, because, you know, I've been interviewed by a lot of men, and when I bring up social media, they seem a little mystified. Like, why is it so bad for young girls? And I think part of it is, you know, they're much less empathetic. They're much less socially aware in the same way that women are. Women naturally, especially in adolescence, we compare ourselves to each other. We compare our bodies to each other. That's a very sort of normal inclination. And when we see each other torn apart on social media, it affects us in ways that I don't think it affects young boys at all, in the same way. That's not to say it doesn't, you know, social media isn't bad for them too, but it's really a destructive force for young women.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think social media also, you know, the internet in general, just the way that the last couple generations have been raised is there's this idea of an escape in the internet, you know, fandom culture, finding people who have the same interests as you and the same sort of teenage obsessions. And I think that kind of can coincide with the way that they're viewing, you know, transgenderism. They almost treat it as another one of these obsessions. And I know you talked a lot in your book about anorexia. So that's, can you kind of explore like the connection that you made between that and how you came to see the similarities between the two movements?
Sure. I mean, so anorexia is a social contagion. This was something that Lisa Littman, the public health researcher, noticed, that this transgender identity seemed to be very similar to, among teenage girls, very similar to anorexia, in that it was the same demographic. It was girls in distress. It was girls sharing each other's pain. Girls convincing themselves of symptoms, for instance, you know, oh, I'm so fat, or oh, I'm so dysphoric, and really spreading it in very much the same way over the internet with these motivational, you know, influencers who motivate them to greater and greater self-harm.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So what do you think is the most important thing that we can do, or number of things we can do, you know, as activists to try to draw young women and girls away from this, I mean, what is essentially a sort of ideological cult, and try to, you know, encourage them out of that?
You know what? I think one of the biggest ways, and this is really funny, but I don't think it necessarily needs to be, it should be countered with, you know, correct science and things, you know, biological sex and what else, and what have you. But I also think it needs to be countered with in-person friendships. These girls need their girlfriends. They need to spend time with them in person without their phones. They need to like hug and share things and write in their diaries all the things they're not doing today, because they need to know that they're not alone. And when they, instead of telling their girlfriends all their secrets and all their pains, when they take it to the internet, they're taking it to a very dark and very disturbed place. That's not where you want your daughter to get her answers from.
It's true. And, you know, on the internet, you can be pretty much whatever you want. You can present yourself as whatever you want in order to get whatever kind of reaction or attention you want. And it seems like that has sort of carried over into their perception of reality in some way.
That's right. You connected it to fandom, and I think that's exactly right. People don't realize that. It really is escapist, but it's also about self-alienation. It's really about these girls steeping themselves in becoming more and more alienated from who they are and alienated from their bodies. And we need to get them away from that.
Yeah.
You are listening to WLRN.
So your book comes out this week, is that right?
Yeah, it came out on Tuesday, yesterday.
Yeah. So, and I read something, and I saw that maybe somebody said it wasn't true or it was, I'm not sure, but I read that Amazon banned an ad for it. Is that true?
Yes, it did.
Oh, wow.
You're allowed to sponsor ads promoting teenage girls with no history of gender dysphoria, no childhood history, to medically transition. That's all over. They have tons of sponsored ads for books like that. But for a book that's skeptical of that, a book that suggests maybe this isn't a good thing for young women, that gets banned. That does not get a sponsored ad.
Yeah. What other sort of, have you had any other experiences, with the backlash, sort of the no, silencing, no platforming, thought policing? Like, what has the reaction been?
Sure. So there's a big effort underway to get my publisher to drop me. There's been a big concerted effort. And, people ask why I went with a conservative publisher on this, because it's not a conservative book. I left politics out of it because I really don't think this book is about politics. It's about how young women are doing. And you know what? I went with a publisher that was willing to stand by me. And today, that's not something you can take for granted. I have watched so many publishers drop authors on controversial topics, and there's a major campaign right now. So I'm very grateful to my publisher for standing by me.
Yeah, I think that's something a lot of the feminist organizations like Women's Liberation Front, they've encountered, that the only, media and sources willing to sort of give them a platform to speak are more conservative publications and organizations. And it's not that, we align with their ideas on, feminism or, other ideas that they have or other opinions. But it seems like on this particular topic, even though they may be coming from a different perspective, they're the only ones who are willing to let us speak, even if they don't necessarily agree with everything that we say. But it seems like it's really the only option, it seems.
And I think it's important to take that route when you find common cause with someone, because young girls are hurting themselves. They're hurting themselves in irreparable ways. Like that's just a huge red flag. So if someone's willing to talk to you about it and work together with you, I just think there's just too much at risk not to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, I don't know if you saw recently sort of this, I guess you would call it maybe an expose, or at least a sort of an overview of what's going on with Tavistock, which is the gender clinic in the UK. And I think it was on BBC, was actually talking about how, they've uncovered all these documents and, testimonies from former doctors who worked there about how, they've been promoting this sort of gender transition as, conversion therapy, because, we have these conservative parents coming in saying, oh, I'd rather have a trans son than a lesbian daughter. I mean, how do we approach that? Because that's obviously not really the stance that your book is taking, or that I would take as a feminist, because we're pretty much the opposite of that. So how do you address that stance?
So a couple of things. So I was able to interview one of the men who, wonderful guy, Marcus Evans, who resigned from the Tavistock clinic over the stuff that came out of that clinic, showing that these girls were not being helped by puberty blockers and they were being fast tracked. It's interesting. You say it's conservative parents, but by and large, the parents that I deal with are mostly progressive, even the ones who are uncomfortable with homosexuality. So in other words, they're more comfortable with it there seems to be a real discomfort with it, among some people, and I can't say I understand this, but for some reason they think transition is somehow easier for them to accept. I don't pretend to understand where this is coming from.
Yeah, I guess to me, it's the way I see the whole trans ideology is that it's actually reinforcing, regressive gender roles, because it's saying, if you like pink, you're a girl. If you like blue, that kind of thing. So it seems like that's so ingrained in our culture that people would be more comfortable with some sort of ideology that sticks to that in a sort of flip-flop reversed way than, addressing maybe they have a gay kid, which is still, homophobia is still rampant across society. So to me, that's how I see it.
Well, I'll tell you though, so it's interesting because, look, I'm Gen X. I'm at the end of Gen X. And honestly, we have not raised our kids with these, completely anachronistic these completely outdated stereotypes. So I don't know that society, does society really tell girls that they can't play with trucks anymore? I know that gender ideologues in schools are teaching that because they have to introduce these archaic stereotypes in order to discuss gender. But I don't see it being pushed as much on anybody else. And I think that's part of the reason that these gender ideologues have to teach it in the public school, is that many of these kids have never heard of it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think it's definitely, in terms of pushing gender roles on kids, it's definitely a lot better than it was, 50 years ago. But I think as you said, now with social media, things like Instagram beauty culture and the anorexia, on, sites like Tumblr, and there's sort of a whole new, a new generation of, you would call it gender roles, because it is most targeted at girls. So, even though feminism has made a lot of strides in a lot of ways, it seems like this is regressing. Big part of the sort of violent pornified culture that you talked about as well is just things are actually regressing in a lot of ways for women. It's just being reframed as like, oh, it's, if you choose it, then it's an empowering choice, that kind of thing.
I think you're right. I think you really nailed it when you said it's coming from the internet and the social media sites, because that is where you get these bizarre airbrushed images of hyper feminized girls. And it's funny because when I interview teenage girls, I ask them and they say, well, I didn't feel perfectly feminine. And I would say to them, but who's perfectly feminine? Like, look around society. There are women occupying every role. What are you talking about? And very often what would come out is they were talking about stars on the internet. They weren't talking about in the real world.
Yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. So, the timing timing for your book seems to be perfect, considering, the recent headlines and backlash over Jk Rowling, which I'm sure you've read about, and you've seen what's happened with her and everything that she's come out with. Is that right?
Yeah, it's really shocking. I think what she did was wonderful. I think it was very brave and very important in standing up for women and girls, because women have suffered and young women feel this, I think, a terrible demotion in society. We are watching mediocre biological boys outcompete them and take their trophies. These are our best young women. We are watching biological males, force themselves into their locker rooms. And when they complain, they're told, sorry, that's our policy. These young girls notice. They notice they've been demoted in the broader culture. And, Jk Rowling brought up the fact that this is not a safe way. This is not a safe future for young women. And I really think, it took a lot for her to say, a lot of courage for her to say that, because she had everything to lose.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I really admire it.
Yeah. It seems like a lot of women have been coming out, at least, from what I've seen on the internet, women who have been silent up to this point are starting to speak out and starting to have the courage to speak out. So it seems like maybe there's a chance that, the tides could be turning. Although on the flip side, the backlash against her has, been pretty powerful as well. What impact do you think it'll have on this whole movement, the whole phenomenon, to see someone that famous, come out with something like that?
It's scary. Think about Martina Navratilova, this remarkable athlete, this remarkable woman who was probably the proudest and finest openly lesbian athlete America had seen. And we were so proud of her. And all she said was, when biological boys are competing with girls, it's not fair. And Athlete Ally dropped her, her sponsor. Her sponsor said she was anti-LGBTQ. And every young girl saw that and said, if they can take down Martina, I don't have a chance.
Yeah. Yeah, we did I actually wrote an article with WLRN last year all about the whole males and women's sports phenomenon. And just, people have this perception that, oh, well, if they go on testosterone or if they go on estrogen for a few months, then they're basically the same as women. And, so a lot of my research was breaking down exactly all of the physical, biological differences between males and females, and how it will never be equal. It will never be fair for them to just march in. And I mean, the results show that, obviously. I mean, they're outperforming women everywhere that they invade, essentially.
Yeah, and I think it comes from profound ignorance. Our science is so politicized that people are just so ignorant today. I mean, the body is so, after men enjoy the enormous advantage of testosterone during puberty, their bodies are so different. They have so much more muscle mass and fast twitch muscle fiber and stronger bones and more oxygenated blood and larger lungs. Women don't have a chance. And the idea you can give them a few shots of estrogen and equal it out is ludicrous.
It is, and that's such a important thing that you mentioned, is that science is politicized, and I think that's the scariest thing about all of this, and about, you know, all the other aspects where science is ignored in favor of, you know, people's feelings, like, you know, the flat earthers and that kind of thing. I mean, it's scary to think that science can be so controversial nowadays.
I mean, imagine this. They teach gender ideology. So I did a whole exploration of the California public school system. They teach gender ideology right alongside sexual health and sexually transmitted disease. So they will teach you things like sexually transmitted disease can be transmitted through, you know, intercourse, and you should use a condom, and a person can choose their gender. And just because a doctor assigned you a gender at birth doesn't mean that's who you really are. All of this gibberish is being taught alongside science.
Yeah, it's interesting. I don't really understand it. I guess I've kind of always been the type where, you know, you read something new, you hear new facts, new information, you're like, okay, I'm gonna change the way that I think about this, because I don't want to be ignorant anymore. But I know that for a lot of people, they want to cling to what's comfortable to them, and I think that's really dangerous.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, I think we really need to take a really hard look at a lot of this social media and a lot of the ideology that's being pumped into our youth, and take a really skeptical look about whether we're doing them more harm than good.
Yeah, I agree. Well, actually, those are all the questions that I had. But if there's anything else that you wanted to bring up, or anything else you want our listeners to know, please feel free.
I would just like to give them hope. You know, young women go through such a hard time during adolescence. We all do. It's very confusing. And I've followed a lot of these girls and their stories, and there is hope. Don't lose hope. They do come back. Mm-hmm. And so, I would say stay in touch with your daughters. Don't let them completely cut off from you if you can help it. And if they're going through this period of confusion, don't think you've lost them for good.
Yeah. That's very good advice. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I appreciate you speaking with me so much. I loved reading your book.
Oh, thank you.
I think it's really time that we see books like this coming out. I mean, and it's hard, like as you mentioned, to find people willing to publish them. And I know Jk Rowling's publisher has had, a lot of complaints. There's people trying to get her dropped, and it's just funny because you think, well, you can't cancel someone who's that big, but it's tough out there. So
it's just unbelievable. We're sending a message to our children that if you don't like what someone says, you get them thrown out. You don't argue with them. You don't present your facts. You don't present your evidence. You just get them canceled.
Yes.
It's crazy.
And this is why I honestly wish debate skills were like a mandatory class in high school, because they're teaching, these kids have this idea that you can't engage with anyone who disagrees with you on anything. You just have to shut them out and live in your bubble. And it's like, that's not the real world. You can't get through life that way. So.
Yeah. And also what I think is, it's so reductive, because you know what, people can be, irrational about one thing or wrong about something and wonderful in other ways. And right. Learning to live with each other is really important.
It's true. Yeah. Nobody's right about everything. That's for sure.
Right. Exactly. Yeah. Oh, it's great to talk to you.
Yeah. Thank you again. It's great to talk to you as well. Thanks for tuning in to my interview with Abigail Shrier, author of the new book, Irreversible Damage, The Transgender Craze, Seducing Our Daughters, now available for purchase. To learn more about WLRN and to support our efforts, please visit our website at wlrnmedia.wordpress.com.